I think the important thing is to understand that people are trying to get into your network and your systems every minute of every day of every year. It's not something that people will go and hit a pause button because you've decided to celebrate Australia Day or Christmas.
This is KBcast.
Are they completely cyber
As a
secure?
primary target for ransomware campaigns,
Is
as you
security and
pointed out,
testing and performance and scalability.
risk and
We
compliance,
can actually automate that.
take that data and use it.
Joining me now is Gerry Sillars, more commonly known as Gerry, Vice President APJ from Semperis, and today we're discussing Semperis' new holiday risk report. So Gerry, thanks for joining and welcome.
You're welcome, Carissa. Thank you for having me. Pleasure to be here.
Okay, so I know we're sort of a little bit on since the holidays, but again, there's more holidays coming up this year, etc., where people sort of let their guard down. So maybe let's start with the quote, attackers don't take holidays though. So walk me through this, Gerry.
I guess that depends when your holidays are, first and foremost. Carissa, I'm talking to you from Singapore today, and we've just finished. In fact, for most of the island, we haven't finished yet the Lunar New Year or the Chinese New Year holidays. So all around the planet, people are taking different holidays and different vacations at different times, obviously. And I think that the quote, attackers don't take holidays, not 100% I would agree. I'm sure your average hacker will be relaxing on a beach with a pina colada, the same as the rest of us, if he's had a good month or a good quarter. But I certainly think it's true to say that attackers don't take holidays at the same time as we would go and take holidays. And quite often, again, as you know, the activities or the various activities of attackers quite often automated now. So, we live in a world where that threat is constant today. I think, just from a highlight perspective, I think the important thing is to understand that people are trying to get into your network and your systems on every minute of every day of every year. It's not something that people will go and pause button because you've decided to celebrate Australia Day or Christmas.
Well, it's the same thing with physical robberies, though, isn't it? People know that families are going away over the holiday break, right? So then it's sort of an easy way and a vulnerable way that people can start to rob their house. Effectively, it's the same for cybercrime.
100%, yeah. We have a family tradition. We've had it for probably two decades plus now of watching Home Alone on Christmas Day, and the wet bandits certainly hang about, or the wet bandits in that movie hanging about to wait for everyone to go on their Christmas vacations before they break into their premises. So, yeah, I mean, it's kind of logical when you think about it, right? I mean, I know there's stats and numbers we'll talk about specific to this holiday report, but it kind of makes sense. You're going to try and break in, whether that's physically or digitally, to an organisation when there's at least less people about, if not everyone's disappeared. I mean, obviously, as a business, you've always got some form of IT staff covering your holiday periods, but yeah, totally agree.
So let's move into the stats. So in the report, it says 69% of organizations that were targeted by ransomware were attacked on a weekend or a holiday. Now, we've obviously just gone through that, so that number clearly doesn't surprise you. But maybe talk us through a little bit more behind that number.
I think that number doesn't surprise me in the context of how many organizations as you know, this is an addendum to our annual ransomware report that we did, and we specifically polled Australian organizations for this holiday report. But I think the more stunning stat for me was that 83% of organizations we polled last year were targeted by ransomware in the past 12 months. That's a stunning number, and lots of people think ransomware is a thing of the past. I mean, it's absolutely and clearly not. And of that 83%, I think the number was something like 78% of them paid a ransom, and a very high number paid a ransom on multiple occasions as well. So the 69%, less surprising, again, just as we were discussing earlier on, you're going to look for any advantage you can get if you're trying to break into someone's premises, either digitally or physically. So the 69% number is less surprising for me than when I first read this report. And I've only been with this company 6 months, so I hadn't looked at prior reports, but I think stunning just some of the numbers in terms of, ransomware is real. It's still real today. It has been for over a decade now. And, clearly we, as an industry and certainly from a consumer perspective, still not doing enough to to mitigate that risk that makes it so attractive to cybercrimes.
So when you said before, still not doing enough, define enough.
One of the challenges, and certainly, the end of the market that we're in is all about protecting identity and all about protecting the core of identity, which we define as Active Directory specifically, and an Entra ID cloud version, Microsoft's cloud version of Active Directory, and directory services in general. Because if Active Directory is down, then you get no access to any applications, you can't access anything in an organization. So, and this is certainly an area, again, some of these stats, we made announcements last week on exceptional growth again. We expect to have a great year this current year as well. Organizations, I think historically, and you work in the cyber industry, you've been a practitioner as well, Carissa. So we, in this industry, tend to talk about, you'll remember the times when we were saying the perimeter was the new edge, and people were spending tens of millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars on firewalls and IPSs, etc. And then the edge was the new perimeter. Gartner have said over the last year that identity is the new perimeter. So I think, while I say not doing enough, I think we're very often driven, and certainly buyers are very often driven by what's in vogue at times. But, the key, the crown jewels of any organization, in our opinion, is that core identity system. So, and certainly, talking to and looking at the organizations that we engage with and looking at the stats from this report, I would say that organizations today aren't doing enough to go and protect their crown jewels, their core identity systems.
Okay, so looking at some of the stats a little bit more. So you guys have broken it down by areas or verticals. So you've got, I'll just read them out because people don't have it in front of them. Has education at 50%, manufacturing 44%, finance 57%, IT telecommunications 72%, healthcare 71%, and travel transportation 100%.
Yep.
So 100%, like obviously that's quite calculative on that front. So is there anything that you can sort of share around, you don't have to go into all of them, but as I read out some of those stats, is there any sort of additional intel that you can share with us today, Gerry?
I think there are some industries that we see that are more susceptible, I would say, to ransomware attacks, and quite often that's just by the very nature of them being so distributed, and and or possibly under investment in staff in particular, and access to funds to go and protect their environments. So the travel and transport industry, hopefully when you see this next year, has got a better rating than that. I think also we've seen a marked shift, I think, over the last few years from the various actors going and targeting critical infrastructure for maximum disruption. Quite often is what organizations are, the various organizations are looking to go and cause as much as for commercial gain. So, travel and transportation, we've seen many over the last few years. We've seen a few in Australia just in the last year or two as well. So, again, I was surprised that number was so high from a travel and transportation perspective. But when I think it through, it's less surprising. The high value assets that you go and disrupt an airline, for example, you can very quickly define how much money they're going to lose, and across a matter of minutes, hours, and days, if you have complete fleets of aircraft grounded, as we've seen again, even not even from a ransomware perspective, but the CrowdStrike event last year. So mass destruction across the globe, and an inability for people to get on planes, and that is a continuing story. Hundreds of millions of dollars lost in a very short space of time.
Yeah, so I know that all of those industries are important, but if I just focus on, again, following this a little bit more with, transportation, for example. Now, I know that you're in Sydney last week when we caught up, but recently trains weren't operating. So I was trying to, a few weeks prior, trying to catch up with people. They live further out in Sydney, or they live even like an hour from Sydney. It really impacted them, but it also impacted people that are frontline workers. They couldn't get to the hospital. They couldn't go to university, couldn't go to school or any of those sort of things. But it does have a domino effect quite quickly, right? Like, especially for people, if they can't get home, then all of a sudden, well, what do? You got to walk home, you got to get an Uber, then Uber's automatically surge. There's just not enough capability to move people around. So do you think that, again, to your point, going on the transportation side of things, it's just this was an easier target because the impact can be seen quite quickly, right? And just how much people all of a sudden just they can't get around at all.
Hugely impactful, and flow that down as well into many years ago. Maersk was a very well documented breach that caused global disruption. We had Toll Holdings in Australia, a double whammy on Toll Holdings just a few years back. And when you start to think about ramifications and downstream effect, when transportation is impacted, so if it's airlines, if it's people that are moving goods around the planet, so your short term, your immediate term effects are, you might struggle to get home. You've got to look for alternative transport. You may have to, bunk with a friend. You may have to, if you were me, end up in a pub longer than you'd probably ideally like to. Things like the Toll Holdings one was interesting because one of our advisors at the time was the CISO at British Petroleum. And because they were so heavily impacted by that, Toll Holdings provided the confectionery and sandwiches, etc., to all of the stations globally. We had to take a decision on whether we were going to close the shops at the gas stations until they could get back up and running, because I think the stats something like 80% of people that go into a gas station go to buy Snickers and Mars bars and stuff like that, not actually to buy fuel. So that to them was reputational damage impact of keeping those shops open. So yeah, I mean, again, it's high value asset, has massive upstream and downstream implications if you can go and disrupt any, whether that's trains, buses, airlines, very high value and maximum disruption.
So I'll move on again now to another stat here. So 78% of respondents reduced their staffing by as much as 50%. Now, there's various reasons to this and theories, but, from your perspective, Gerry, and what you're seeing here at Semperis, what was sort of the reasoning for that? Is it because people don't want to work weekends? It's just that companies didn't believe they needed as many staff? When people out, especially around Christmas time, they go to work, they get a bit of FOMO. Like, well, what is it?
Yeah, I mean, I think, fundamentally people have got to take holidays first and foremost, just from a quality of life perspective, mental health, all that good stuff. But again, I think there's a tendency to believe, I mean, if you're working a 9 to 5 or an organisation that work 9 to 5, then the vast majority of staff are probably often on a weekend, whether your weekend's Saturday, Sunday, whether your weekend's Friday, Saturday, depending where you live. Kind of makes sense. Just that if 80% of my staff or 90% of my staff don't work weekends, then I don't need the same amount of staff from an IT perspective, whether that's cyber or anything else. So obviously, there's a cost associated with having people working both weekends and holidays. Organisations, I mean, there's an absolute hit to how much does it cost me to go run an operation if I've got larger percentages of my staff working at a weekend or over a holiday.
This is where it gets interesting because, I've spoken to people on the show about, how do you find the balance between, you can't a business isn't a business to make money. So I get it to a point where, yes, you got to be secure, you got to do that. But it's going to come a point where businesses can't put all of their money into cybersecurity. So how do you strike the balance between we've got to do enough, therefore, we're not getting ransomware attacks, out the eyeballs, and we have to have staff where it helps us enough, but also being cognizant to be like, businesses aren't going to pull all their money on cybersecurity. They're just not going to do that. So what would be your advice to manage that, where people are sort of staying safe, but are managing, like you said, the cost of having staff right around the clock?
Yeah, I mean, I think in all instances, people, as you say, I mean, businesses are in business to make money, right? Every business will go to define what risk looks like and will invest in operational risk, business risk. They'll make investments, whether that's in cyber or whether that's in physical security or whether that's in whatever they do to go and mitigate risk in an organisation. And I think for every organisation, and again, we've both been in the cyberspace for quite some time. Cyber budgets are incomparable to where they were a decade ago and 2 decades ago. So, I mean, organizations in general, I think, understand the significance of cyber and cyber associated to business risk. So, but it is a challenge. One of the things that we have just about to announce is an operational risk tool, where we'll consult with organizations and work with them so they properly understand, how do I go and recover from a disaster? What does a disaster look like? Because again, a big part of that's just a black hole for organizations today. They understand and may understand where some of the gaps are from a technology perspective, but don't necessarily understand how to go and recover a business and what processes and people they need to go and put in at the back of that. So it's a bit of a conundrum. People's appetites to risk typically are different as well. So I think for most organisations, it's down to risk appetite. What can they afford to go and invest? I mean, no one's got an open checkbook to go and just throw it at technology and staff and humans to protect them from a cyber attack.
But do you sometimes think as well, and I'm looking at this really outside the box, that cyber people just have this view like, because again, like it's like we gotta have, if A doesn't work, then we go to B, go to C, then we go to D, E, F, G, H. Like we can't, that's just not realistic for businesses. Like people go bankrupt. So, and I know you've sort of answered it, but I think this point's really, really important. How do people manage that without compromising themselves? Of course, like you said, reputational damage. But they're not going bankrupt at the same time. Like you said, they can't just keep throwing endless amounts of money at things that may or may not solve the problem.
Yeah, I agree. And it's got to be, I think from a starting point, I'm sure all organizations do this. What does disaster look like? How do we go and recover from a disaster? How much would it cost us to go and recover from a disaster? And what investments do we need to go and make to ensure that doesn't happen? And to go and then focus on how do we get back to a minimal viable position as quickly as possible. So again, that's all, we talk a lot about operational risk we talk about operational resilience. Sorry, we also talk, everyone talks about cyber resilience, but for us, it's more about the people, the process, plus the technology at the back end. But again, it isn't simple. And again, you brought up a very valid point there. You do a lot of trade shows. And, if you go to particularly large cyber trade shows, it's a kind of thankless task. I see, so when you if you go to RSA and you walk into a hall that's got, maybe up to 1,000 cyber companies, all doing slightly different things, all trying to convince you that their new shiny toy is the most important shiny toy that you should have in your portfolio. So, I think taking that baseline, understand, again, going back to what I said earlier on, and as going to consult with organizations on, from a incident response, operational risk perspective, what's your baseline? What are the most important things for you to stay in operations as an organization? And go and surround certainly those crown jewel systems with, to my mind, and I think to our mind as an organisation, that's where the investment needs to be. The investment needs to be at how do we go and protect the things that are core to us operating as a business.
Do you think as well, Gerry, that companies, I know you said before, how long does it take to recover from a disaster, the impact, the cost, the long tail impact as well, etc. We've spoken about all these things at length, but do you also think, and I hate to say it, but yes, the business continuity side of things. Now, I'm going to then elaborate on that. For example, fast food place, I don't know, McDonald's and Friends, they're probably shipping out a lot of Happy Meals and whatever else goes there. You got to think, imagine if McDonald's didn't operate for an hour, 2 hours, 4, 5, 24 hours. How much is even revenue that they would lose, let alone, hey, we got to bring in some really expensive external consultants to do all the forensics and do all these other things and PR people and legal people. Forget that. Just the actual loss of revenue for those hours. Do you think people are focused on what that looks like?
Yeah, 100%, without a shadow of a doubt there. Yeah, and if you want a McDonald's and you can't get McDonald's, you'll go to Hungry Jack's down the street if you're burning desirous to have a burger at that moment in time. So, every organisation that I talk to understands and factors in all of those permutations when they are looking at risk. So, risk is loss of immediate revenue, risk. And going back to the Optus outage that we had in Australia, whenever that was a couple of years ago now, that had obviously a really significant impact to everyone, quickly followed by Medibank. So pretty horrific for Australia as an economy and as a country reputationally. The immediate impact was, I think I saw something that I recall saying that the next quarter impact was a loss of revenue of about $1.6 billion. Now, the downstream impact of that, I'm taking years to go and recover and get back to the same position that we're in. But for sure, organisations do try and factor in all of those aspects when they're thinking about the value of the tech that they've got deployed. And the vast majority of enterprises that I talk to today now typically have a dollar value on an asset, a digital asset. So, an Oracle database may have an X value, AD may have an X plus 5 value, just in terms of if we lost that, what is the damage to the business, and all of those factors typically are factored in.
So, from your experience, Jerry, what do you think people aren't factoring in then? Is there anything that comes to mind when I ask you that question?
Yeah, I think that, again, going back to what I said earlier on, and increasingly spending time consulting with organisations on operational resilience, I think there's a general lack of appreciation and comprehension of what do we do as an organisation in the event of a disaster. So, in the event of how do we go and respond as an organisation? So, and that's what we're trying to help organisations with. So, we've got the tools to help them go and recover ransomware attack, help them go and recover all that stuff. We've got the tools to go and help them take preventative actions to hopefully mitigate the risk of that happening. But quite often it is the people in the process, and that extends far beyond just the technical aspects, the IT aspects of that. As you said earlier on, when you're talking about risk and business risk and reputational risk, there's a whole bunch of moving parts when something goes wrong. There are good ways to go and respond to an incident, and really, we've seen hundreds of really good examples of how not to go and do it. So there's a lot more to it than just getting the tech fixed. There's, depending on which industry you're in, you might need to go and notify a regulator within a set period of time. You might need to notify the government within a set period of time. You certainly need to go and notify your consumers in a period of time with a plan on how to get back to a good state. So yeah, again, it's and organisations typically that we talk to don't do that particularly well, or don't do it as well as they think they do, because they're all looking at each other. When we do these tabletop exercises with organisations, everyone in the room's just looking at each other. It's a bit scary.
So then on that note, why would you surmise why there's a lack of appreciation and comprehension? Or would you say that hindsight's a wonderful thing? And what I mean by that is, I don't know, example would be what comes to mind. You're riding a bike without a helmet. It was fine the first 50 times, but then, I don't know, maybe you're a bit hungover the next day and you're riding your bike without a helmet and you fall over and you hurt your head and it hurts. So do you think that that's unfortunately, because we've seen it happen over the years, oh, well, we should have done more when, something happens. So would you say that's maybe why there's that lack of appreciation?
I think there's part of that, and that example you gave, the result of that can be life-ending, right? It can be catastrophic. You might not just have a sore head, you might expire. So yes, I do think that organisations are doing a lot to go and try and mitigate risk. Again, we live in a time and in a world where new risks keep coming at us day after day after day. So I think there's it's certainly not a tendency, I don't think, to go and bury your head in the sand. But I think in a lot of organisations, probably mid-sized enterprises rather than the biggest enterprises, there's still sometimes at a board level a lack of appreciation of just what that risk is. So again, to your point, lots of people riding about on bikes without helmets.
So now I want to sort of get back to the report again. And this was interesting, which I think we sort of know the answer to, but I want to, illuminate the stat, which was 50% of companies were victimized by a ransomware attack after a material corporate event. So you mean like a Christmas party, things like that?
Depends how good the Christmas party was, I guess. But no, it depends how much money you spend on the Christmas party as well. But no, a material corporate event would more likely be something like an IPO or a merger or acquisition or a divestment. So something that is deflecting in the business's attention, because the imperative in those instances is to achieve the business outcome, and not security per se, or not whatever per se. It's not really specific to security in that instance. But when people are laser focused on a business outcome that is out of the norm, so again, think about a merger where you're going and consuming other people's technology. I met with a 2IC to a CISO in Australia recently in an organisation that do a lot of acquisitions of smaller businesses. It's basically their business model. And I said, how much time do you get to go and assess the IT risk and the cyber risk? And they said normally about 2 days before the deal's done. So I think, that's what we mean by a material corporate event, where the business is laser focused on achieving the outcome for the business. And in those instances, security takes a back seat.
So speaking of back seats, as you were speaking, what about large? So, for example, major vendors have major conferences around the world. So, do you think that even from a vendor perspective, that they're focused on doing these big conferences, right? Or conversely, you got RSA and places like that where people are so focused on that. Do you think as well that could be an opportunity where people's guards are a bit down, perhaps, or they're not, their eyes aren't maybe as focused as they normally are because they have a big event in front of them, etc.
Could be. I mean, it depends on. I guess that depends on the size of the organisation, Carissa. Your core IT staff, your defenders of an organisation are less likely to be involved in going to a large event like that. But again, I mean, anything that's taking people away from their day jobs and going and doing something else, where they're working somewhere else 9 to 5 and not focused on what the day job would be. Yeah, for sure. I mean, it could be, but less of a challenge, I think, than the ones that I discussed earlier.
Yeah, so I think it would just even be the people attending those events, right? That are, perhaps there's thousands of people, perhaps that could be an opportunity. I mean,
Yeah, I mean, that's as good as a holiday, I guess. You've got a 70, 80,000, whatever it is, 100,000 IT staff attending RSA. I'm sure there'd be an interesting, interesting one to go and see if we could put in a report how many organisations were breached at a time that all the technical staff were attending an event. That would be an interesting stat to have for sure.
yeah, just as you were speaking, that's just what came to mind, right? So I'm going to read out. So again, going through some of the industries, the percentage. So 50% of companies were victimized by a ransomware attack after a material corporate event, which Gerry has outlined. And then to push that a little bit more, 50% was education, 30% in manufacturing, 43% in finance, IT, telecommunications, 54%, and healthcare was 29%. So I'm guessing, again, Gerry, none of those stats really surprise you given what you just discussed. As we're seeing nowadays, there's a lot more, M&A happening, more IPOs, etc. So again, people's guards are probably a little bit down. So it's an opportunity to strike.
For sure. I mean, these organisations are going to research and when organisations are most vulnerable for whatever reason, whether that's holidays, whether that is a major corporate event, whether that's a once in a decade Christmas party or whatever. The attackers are good at their jobs. I mean, people are doing this full time. They're spending as much money more than the people that are trying to defend against them. So they're pretty sophisticated in terms of understanding the best times to go and try and penetrate an organisation. But yeah, I mean, I think probably the only one I think or the most interesting ones maybe healthcare being lower than anyone else. And, perhaps healthcare has a tendency to be 7x24, 365, more so perhaps than some of those other segments.
So how can people prepare for, at the same time? I mean, it's sort of a conundrum a little bit because it's like, if you're getting a company acquired, for example, you want to be able to tell media and get the word out there. But again, you're sort of opening yourself up for risk. So how would you sort of prepare an organization to make sure they are taking the right steps and the right measures? Therefore, they're not underselling all the good news and the things that they're doing, but then also making sure like, hey, we don't have like a massive incident happening at the same time.
I think it's going back to properly understanding people process and the technology required to people process procedure and the technology required to go and mitigate risks. I mean, we are doing an increasing amount of work with some of the big four practices who do a lot of M&A and divestment work in core component when they're advising organisations. And again, you've got to have fairly deep pockets, obviously, if you're engaged in these organisations to go and do this type of work for you. But they are spending months preparing risk analysis of what you need to do. Go and acquire this business. Once it's acquired, what do you need to do to go and try and integrate this business as seamlessly as you possibly can, and or divest this business as simply as you possibly can. So I think a lot of it's around people process, ensuring that you understand the risks and understand what you're going into. Again, it's kind of contradictory to what I said earlier on, because the instance that I gave you where this organisation are typically acquiring smaller businesses, but 2 days notice to go and assess technology risk in an organisation is hardly sufficient. And consulting with partners. So again, I mean, I don't think there's any magic wand to go and fix this, but just understanding at the C level what the risk is first and foremost. So again, typically in the instance of an acquisition or a divestiture, the C level are aware. They've been given a report by whoever they're working with typically to go and understand the risks, the business risks, the technology risks, operational risks, etc. Go and ensure, and again, from our perspective, Active Directory is the most critical and should be the most critical aspect of every merger and acquisition. So ensuring that organisations are working with partners, whether that's us, whether it's Big Four, whether that's some of other partners out there in our ecosystem, to go and understand the risk, the technology risk, and have a plan that we can execute against that delivers the outcome that they require, and make sure that certainly, again, going back to our core component, that those crown jewels are protected, and if the worst happens, you can roll back or recover quickly.
So I just want to ask you probably one more question around the stats. I know that we've covered a lot of ground here again today, but for those of you who want to do a little bit more digging, we will be linking the report in the show notes. So, Gerry, one other question I have for you is A3 respondents say they had an identity recovery plan in place. So maybe walk us through the plan. What does it look like in your eyes, just at a high level?
That's the most surprising stat for me, Carissa, when, again, there's an addendum to the report that says 78% of respondents paid a ransom in the last 12 months. So without me trying to do a whole bunch of arithmetical gymnastics in my head here, I mean, that 83% of respondents said that they had an identity recovery plan in place, yet probably 90% of that 83% ended up with a ransom attack, and about 2/3 of them paid it. So,
but it's probably a basic plan. Is that what you're sort of saying? Like, it's probably rudimentary.
I may have backup and recovery in place, and I think I can go and recover from a backup, for example. But when I go and do that, it didn't work. Or when I went and did that, I was dinged a second time, or a third time, or a fourth time. I think that 32% of respondents in the ransomware report that said it'd been done. I think Germany had the highest instance of people suffering or being paying a ransom multiple times for the same incident. Because the other aspect of this as well is that we're dealing with people that are criminals, and they're not necessarily honourable. Some of them may be, lots of them aren't. So someone tells you you'll get your encrypted data back, and quite often that doesn't happen. Someone tells you pay me once and don't worry about it. Quite often that doesn't happen. So yeah, but I think and again, I see this every day of the week. There is a basic understanding or a basic belief, I think, that people can get their core identity systems, such as Active Directory, but in reality, that doesn't work out so well, and it is disturbing. The organisations that think they've got a plan never actually tested it, or never actually tested it in earnest or with any degree of regularity. So I think people believe that they have an ability to go and recover. Hopefully, they never need to find out that they can, to be honest. But again, I don't think people understand how complex it is to go and recover. And I mean, a core identity system such as Active Directory, Microsoft's best practice is a 29-step process. And if you hand that off to Microsoft to go and do, which they'll do for you, you give them a backup copy. It takes them typically up to 5 days to give you a set of instructions back to say, here's how you go through that 29-step in your environment to go and recover. And follow these steps, follow these specific steps in order, or you'll need to start again. So yeah, I think people believe that they have that covered, but in reality, I don't think they do.
So, Gerry, do you have any sort of final thoughts or closing comments you'd like to leave our audience with today?
Get a plan. You don't want to have the police at your front door with the wet bandits when the wet bandits have flooded your house while you're away for Christmas. I think it's just people process, having a plan, having a recovery plan. We're happy to help, obviously, and we're happy to consult people on how they effectively go and do that. But it's important to understand, though, that you need to be more vigilant. You need to be vigilant all the time, but you need to be as vigilant, if not more vigilant, when you've got a reduced number of staff focusing on defending your environment for whatever reason, whether that's a corporate event, a significant corporate event, or whether it's because it's Christmas or it's Hanukkah or it's Chinese New Year.
This is KBcast, the voice of cyber.
Thanks for tuning in. For more industry-leading news and thought-provoking articles, visit kbi.media to get access today.
This episode is brought to you by Merckset, your smarter route to security talent. Mercsec's executive search has helped enterprise organizations find the right people from around the world since 2012. Their on-demand talent acquisition team helps startups and mid-sized businesses scale faster and more efficiently. Find out more at mercsec.com today.